Welcome to Open Classroom, which is the Brown School's digital forum for community and conversation. I'm Danny Pape, Director of Career Services here at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and you're going to get to engage with a few amazing people in the field here in a moment. I want to quickly do a little bit of housekeeping just so you know how this format will work. First, we're using a webinar format, which means that we can't see or hear you. However, we'd love to know your thoughts and questions, so please feel free to post them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of our program, and we'll be monitoring that throughout. So please don't hesitate to use that. That is how we would love to engage with you. We're also streaming live right now on YouTube. And if you have a friend who couldn't join us in this virtual room, but still wants to watch us live, we will put a link to our YouTube channel in the chat in just a moment. So we'd love for you to send that out to anyone that would love to engage with us live right now. I do want to let you know about a few open classroom programs that you can still register for that are coming up soon. On Thursday, October 27th, we'll continue our artificial intelligence series with the Internet of Medical Things, predicting clinical outcomes with wearables, learning about fascinating clinical trials involving Fitbits. On Thursday, November 10th, we will continue this artificial intelligence series with AI, machine learning, and macroeconomic aspects of health and health policies. And then on November 17th, we'll have a really awesome session for social work response to the election with a great panel of social workers discussing the results of the midterms. We will put a link again to the Open Classroom series so that you know when these events are and can register if you would like. So now to today's program, Collaborative Approaches to Addressing Historical and Intergenerational Trauma. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary McKay, who's the Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Initiatives at Washington University in St. Louis, and also the current president of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. Dr. McKay, I'd love to pass it to you to share the genesis of this web series and introduce Nicholas and the rest of the panelists to get us started.
Wonderful. So thank you, Danny. Thank you, Dale, for being terrific partners. We are so pleased to co-sponsor this webinar series, and this is a series of 6 webinars co-sponsored by the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare and Washington University, and in partnership with, I'm going to have Peter Pecora talk in a minute, in partnership with 3 critically important foundations as we try to advance what we're calling the 21st century research agenda. So what does that mean? This research agenda was put together by a very vast array of stakeholders to really think about what are the gaps in knowledge that we can help fill as scientists to help kids thrive, to help support families, to help support communities that wrap themselves around children and families. And so the Academy feels really privileged to have an Academy Fellow in such a position, within foundation world as well as academic life in Peter. And so Peter, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about the 21st century research agenda, and then I will acknowledge Nicholas and the role that you're going to play in our speakers. But first, Peter, if you want to say a few words.
Sure, happy to, and thank you. Thank you, Mary. What began as a partnership between Casey Family Programs, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the William T. Grant Foundation now has evolved in this, as you've heard Mary mention, a wider coalition of philanthropic and federal organizations that are bolstered by extensive participation with individuals with lived experience in child welfare. And this coalition of folks really believe that we're at a stage now where we need to build on the practice and policy science that's out there, but that we do need some more targeted studies, building on the grand challenges and really prioritizing, at least in this case, this coalition, 19 priority areas for what would it really take to build a 21st century approach to child welfare and child well-being. And now currently this coalition is seeking other funding partners, because we know researchers out there with their community and partners with people with lived expertise really need this funding to push this research agenda forward. So we're filling some of these knowledge gaps. So we're in a stage now of where we've produced 19 sample requests for proposals, RFPs, that we're hoping federal, state, county, and foundation partners will step in. People will step in and start to fund these areas, and we'll make those available through a new website that the Child Welfare League of America is building with the help of this national steering committee that Dr. McKay serves on and others. So I'm going to leave it there. So we've got plenty of time for the speakers today, but we'll be sending out through Dr. McKay and the group here the new child welfare website when that is officially posted, and we'll stay in touch with you as participants that way. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. So we are welcoming three audiences here, those that are live on this webinar with us, those that are streaming this webinar via YouTube, and also we will welcome and get the content to everybody who registered and push it out. Thanks to Nicholas Asher, who is the program coordinator in your chat. He put the executive summary for the 21st Century Research Agenda that Peter was referring to. And one of the core components of that agenda is that we need to do research differently, to collaborate with those with lived expertise. And I cannot think of a better trio to really model for us the kind of work that they have done together. Full transparency, Kara Dean-Assael and I have worked together and collaborated with parent partners, with young people, with system providers for 20 plus years. And Jim Rodriguez, just a few years shy of that. They're extraordinary scientists in their own right, but what they really have done is put collaborative research methods into action so that questions are different, studies are different, and the impact of knowledge is much quicker. Cendie, we have just met, but if you're friends and colleagues and collaborators with Kara and Dean already, I know what a strong partner you are to translate knowledge into action. So for that, I'll come back with Nicholas at the very end and facilitate some questions. Thanks so much. And I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kara Dean-Assael. Thank you so much for being here today with us. I'm joined with my amazing colleagues, Dr. Jim Rodriguez and Cendie Stanford. Jim and I are from the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. Our institute is a poverty institute of the Silver School of Social Work at New York University. There we spend a lot of our time researching various best practices and models of care for behavioral health providers in New York State. We also develop and provide trainings as well as engage consultants with a variety of expertise. And we also participate in a variety of research at our institute as well. Everything that we do is aimed at attending to the root causes and consequences of poverty. We have also recently collaborated with Cendie Stanford, who is here with us from ACEs Matter, and so grateful that her voice can be here with us today, as well as all of her amazing work. I wanted to just take a minute and ask that we just honor our own histories and our own herstories, as well as all of the histories and herstories that come before us. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to our agenda. So we're going to just do a quick welcome. We're going to give you some historical context and historical trauma responses. We're going to have a segment called History Herstory of Intergenerational Trauma around ACEs Matter and ACEs genealogy. We're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach to research and care, talk about a project called Family and Food Matters. We're going to talk about examples of collaborative approaches, collaborating with caregivers and collaborating with communities. So we have a lot to cover in a little bit of time, but we're really excited to be here and talk with you all. If you could just chat in your name really quickly and your location and research or practice interest. We would love to hear that. And I recognize that we're only talking to one of those three audiences, but sorry about that. We would just love to hear from everyone that's right here on this webinar, but I'd love to hear from you all others as well in some way. And so we want to start with a question. Do you consider the impact of historical trauma within your work? Is anyone doing this today? We just would love to know that. So welcome, Tara. Wash Hughes, Perinatal Behavioral Health Services at St. Louis, Cora from St. Louis. Yes. S. McLean, you are. Thank you. Tara, you are. Perfect. Thank you. I love it. I wish we had all day to talk. This is wonderful. Okay.
Audiences.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it on to Jen. You're on mute, Jen.
Trapped. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you all for having me here. I'm going to set a little bit of the context. But before I start, I just want to mention a little bit. So as Kara mentioned, she and I work at the McSilver Institute. I am a social worker and psychologist by training. And I've done a lot of work going back to the 2000s with Mary, actually doing some work in the area of trauma. So I've long had an interest in trauma as a researcher and as a clinician, and now primarily as a trainer. And what I'm going to do today is do a little bit of when Mary was talking to and we were getting ready, you know, she introduced me as a good translators of research. And so what I'm going to present right now is a very brief overview of historical and intergenerational trauma based on my research and understanding of the topic. I can't say that I'm an expert in the field. I am an expert in the field of trauma in many ways, but it's more my thoughts and a bit of a summary of and an overview of the topic. And before we start, I just want to start by saying that the notion of historical trauma can be considered a little controversial at times because it can be seen as a form of pathologizing whole groups of people, right? So when you think about the impacts of trauma and historical trauma, it is by definition trauma of human design that affects groups of people. So there's a controversy around that as we think about that. And of course, it is not our intention to pathologize entire groups of people, and it should never be. We believe, however, that an understanding of historical trauma and its effect on current generations helps clinical professionals, researchers, policymakers, and our healthcare system and other systems overall think critically about intergenerational trauma and its direct and indirect impact on health and mental health, and child welfare, and can also help us better understand the context of the inequities that exist across all our institutions now. And so when we think about historical trauma throughout US history and sadly world history, there have been too many examples of large-scale events that have greatly traumatized specific racial, ethnic, and religious groups. Of course, examples include slavery and Jim Crow, Native American genocide, the Holocaust, and Japanese internment. And I reference these because I'm going to be touching on these as I talk about historical trauma throughout this presentation. So a little bit on terminology. I'd like to start by defining a few things. I realize folks may have a good understanding of this, but I just want to point out a few things. First, for me, historical trauma is really intersecting forms of trauma. So when we think about situational trauma, one form of trauma, or acute trauma, that's the kind of trauma that can occur as a result of a single traumatizing event. For example, a rape, an accident, seeing someone being killed, being caught, all the kind of index traumas that we think about being caught in a natural disaster. And this type of trauma is the one that most mental health professionals are aware of because the trauma is known and the victim of the survivor of the trauma, and we know what the likely cause of the presenting problems are, and they're the focus of treatment, right? This is the one that's most associated, of course, with PTSD. But we know that trauma doesn't just lead to PTSD. So in many ways, as we think about other forms of trauma, there is, in addition to situational trauma, those single events, is exposure to toxic and chronic stress. So when we're talking about toxic and chronic stress here, we're talking about things like ACEs, and Cendie's going to talk a lot more about ACEs later, but for the time being, it's another form of trauma. It's the kind of cumulative effects of a number of experiences that can be had over time, and especially, of course, during early childhood. So those ACEs of adverse childhood experiences can affect people. And we know that the accumulation of those events, especially early in life, can lead to long-term health, behavioral health, and social problems that people can experience. And then, of course, there's intergenerational trauma, as we talk about. And intergenerational trauma affects oftentimes one family, right? It refers to the trauma that is transmitted from one generation to the next via a complex set of processes, genetic, psychological, epigenetic, biological, and social factors. And this can occur, for example, of course, when a parent who's had their own history of trauma oftentimes has difficulties attaching to the child. And these problems can also be transmitted even prenatally in utero. And so we know a lot about those processes, and there's still more to learn about those processes. The other important point to make here is that when we think about approaches to research, there's a lot of research on how to treat situational trauma, right? We know how to treat PTSD, or we know pretty well, and there's always better forms of treatment, but we know pretty well how to treat situational trauma. To a lesser degree, we know how to treat chronic or toxic stress. And when we think about toxic and chronic stress, we know a little bit more about treatment. So our treatments, for example, of complex PTSD, which of course, by the way, is not a formal DSM diagnosis, but there's a lot of treatments out there for for complex PTSD. And then there are some treatments that are focused on intergenerational trauma, but not many. So many of our parenting interventions are in a way focused on trying to address intergenerational trauma as well. For me, historical trauma really comes at the intersection of all of that. And of course, we have very little understanding of how to treat historical trauma. And one of the things that I think is critically important about that distinguishes historical trauma from some of those other forms of trauma is that it can lead to core beliefs that are very different and distinct from the core beliefs that can develop from other forms of trauma. So when we think about situational trauma, yes, people can develop core beliefs about themselves, about their worthiness, about the world around them, about others. So, but when we think about the core beliefs that can develop as a result of historical trauma, it can lead to questions about the limits of human decency, about the limits of human fairness. It can strip people of culture and identity and their humanity. These are so much more profound and can have, obviously, intergenerational effects. And this is just a little bit of a kind of layout of some of the symptoms that we think about when we think about trauma generally, and then when we think about historically based trauma. So on the left-hand side, these are some of what we might call the classic symptoms of PTSD: anxiety and impulsivity, psychic numbing and poor affect tolerance, depression, withdrawal and isolation, guilt, unresolved grief. But when we think about historical trauma, these are some historically based symptoms: perceived obligations, compensatory fantasies, elevated mortality rates, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, identification with ancestral pain, and decreased deceased ancestors, intrusive historical imagery. And I think, again, I could do a whole session just on these symptoms, but I'll just give you an example of what this might look like. And this is from work, and this is dated work, so just from the research, but from Maria Braveheart and the Broom's work on historical trauma. And here's a quote from a 15-year-old Puebla Indian girl, just to sort of demonstrate what we mean by historical trauma. "I just can't talk to my parents. I don't want to burden them with my problems and feelings. They have so much pain of their own. I just can't bring myself to do that. But I feel like I had no one to talk to. That's why I took those pills. I just felt so tired. I wish I could take away their pain. They have suffered so much themselves in boarding school. I'd like to go away to college, but I can't even leave them. I feel so guilty. I have to take care of them," right? Identifying and sort of really encapsulating in many ways, sort of showing us what those symptoms can be. In my research on the topic, I also noticed a very minimal amount of research in the area of historical trauma in African-American families. So here I just wanted to mention a little bit of the work of Joy DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. Again, this is one of those very controversial topics and one of those very controversial conceptualizations of trauma. But Joy DeGruy thinks about trauma almost mathematically. But the way she thinks about it is that post-traumatic slave syndrome is sort of additive. It's the product of multi-generational trauma plus the absence of opportunities in the present that lead to post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she thinks about three distinct patterns of behavior: vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. And in particular, I just want to focus on racist socialization. What she means by that is oftentimes the internalization of white supremacy, the internalization of racism. So in here, she's talking about internalized racism and oppression. And so when we think about the mechanisms of intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, we think about a few areas. One is the conspiracy of silence. There are biological and physiological factors. There's psychosocial mediators. Too much to sort of cover in here, but I'm going to try and do it briefly. Psychosocial mediators looking at attachment security, emotion regulation, availability, and parenting styles. Very quickly, when we think about this idea of the conspiracy of silence, you know, our society often sends mixed messages about what we should and shouldn't remember. And very quickly, you know, when we, for example, we are often taught to remember 9/11, remember the Alamo, right? Remember the sinking of the Titanic. But when we talk about things like slavery, the narrative is often more, let's move on. Right? This is just a quote from Elie Wiesel, who is a Holocaust survivor, many folks know, but this is just his sort of description of the conspiracy of silence. Had we started to speak, we would have found it impossible to stop. I should say that this was him talking in the post-World War II era, what happened right after the end of the World War II. Having shed one tear, we would have drowned the human heart, so invincible in the face of death and the enemy. We now felt helpless. We were mad with disbelief. People refused to listen, to understand, and to share. There was a division between us and them, between those who endured and those who read about it or would refuse to read about it. We thought people would remember our experiences, our testimony, and manage to suppress their violent impulses to kill or hate. And here he's referring to the fact that after World War II, many folks who were in the Holocaust, many Jews in Germany, oftentimes did not get the treatment that they needed. Oftentimes, the services that they received were more in the realm of concrete services. This is a quote from the Sensei research project of those descendants of Japanese internees. Another quote, a lot of times you assume that your parents do not have a past when you're little, and because you live in the present so much. The older I got, I would ask more about their lives, how they got married and how they met. Though through those discussions of camp were conspicuously absent. So I never really learned about the camps through my parents. I got bits and pieces, never a coherent story. And I share this because in the Sensei research project that looked at the second and third generations of Japanese detainees, remember that included folks who were Japanese nationals, as well as Japanese American citizens who were interned. And oftentimes the impact of that, of those experiences often led to many health and mental health outcomes, including early death, especially among those who were Japanese nationals. And one of the things that they talk about in the research project is how many of the early deaths could be attributed to the shame that many of those Issei, the, again, Japanese nationals, who really value the importance of loyalty. And in many ways, their death was attributed to the shame that they felt for having their loyalty questioned. And then as we think about additional mechanisms, again, these are some that we do know of, and we still need more research in this space, but some of the biological mechanisms, how the HPA axis is impacted and in leading to dysregulation of cortisol. ACEs related to HPA dysfunction. Cortisol dysregulation is oftentimes seen in trauma survivors and the descendants of trauma survivors. And one of the things I want to point out is that growing research on epigenetics and neuroplasticity are showing that some of these problems are reversible. And then when we think about the psychosocial mechanisms, there's genetic risks, parental mental health issues, attachment security, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the importance of the attachment environment. So the parent who's impacted by trauma and toxic stress oftentimes can have difficulties attaching with their children. And then there's also shared trauma experiences, collective trauma experiences that result from historical trauma. And then recurring patterns of racism and discrimination. So we also know, of course, that these events took place in the past, but we still have. And as we see in this day and age, especially with the attacks on things like critical race theory and understanding our past, and in many ways trying to promote greater silence of these issues that can ironically lead to recurring patterns of racism and discrimination, and then of course segregation. So these are all the mechanisms that take place in promoting and continuing the cycle of historical trauma. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Cendie.
Hey, I'm you. Thank you, Jim. Great presentation. So I am so happy to be a part of this circle. My given name at birth is Cendie Stanford. It is not misspelled. I actually am named after my grandmother. Speaking of historical trauma. Uh-oh, this thing is just doing its own thing. Is that me, Kara? It went off. I need to go back. How do I go? Okay, there we go. Thank you. So my arm in this conversation is coming from the lens of a lived experience survivor. And I know that this is what this classroom is about. And I had the opportunity to meet Kara and Jim when they happened to see my genealogy tree on social media. I learned about adverse childhood experiences during COVID 2020. And similar to what Jim just said is that I started to see this from a mathematical standpoint as a lived experience survivor. Never been to research. I was a school principal. I was a school teacher. And when I learned about adverse childhood experiences, I was like, oh my goodness, everybody needs to know about this. And so I want to share with the researchers in the audience that's listening that I learned about the adverse childhood experience study because I was at a copy machine and somebody left the quiz on the copy machine in 2020. And at this time, I am 42 years old. And what this did for me is it presented to me some numbers that I really needed to pay attention to, just as important as if I had high cholesterol or diabetes. Like, these were numbers that I needed to know. And I was 42 and somebody left the worksheet on the copy machine and I just happened to grab it and answer the questions as I was waiting. Turns out that I learned from the original study that my ACE score was a 10. My positive childhood experience score was a 5. And my resilience score, based on the study that was done, was a 12 out of 14. And I left that conversation wondering, like, how did I make it out? If they say that this stuff is that bad to children and some of this stuff is irreversible, how in the world did I make it out? Which is what led me to finding ACEs matter. So out of curiosity, if you are in the chat and you don't mind doing this, I would love to know from the people that can chat, if you can remember as a child, if you were told, I have no idea why it's doing that, Kara, like not even touching the mouse. Okay, go back. If you remember being told, what were the 3 things in life that they told us that we were guaranteed of? Does anybody remember that? The 3 things in life that are guaranteed? Drop that in the chat if you don't mind. And I have no idea why my thing is doing that, but it's okay. For me, it was taxes. What was life, death, and taxes. That's what I remember being told as a child. You can guarantee that those 3 things would come up. And there it is. I see some people chatting. And then when I learned about ACEs and how common they were, I said, I think that a lot of people are going to have life, death, taxes, and ACEs. And that's where this chart came in. So from my vantage point, researchers, all I saw, as you notice with the eyes, was people dying early. I never knew about everything underneath that. Right? From my vantage point as a child, I watched my brother get killed. I didn't watch him get killed, but my brother was killed at 20 in the zip code where I was raised. I had murderers in my family. Like, all I saw around me was death. And so I naturally assumed as a child, it was just the way things were around the world. And then from my lens, there were movies to validate what I was seeing in my neighborhood, like Boys in the Hood. And so all that to say is when I learned about ACEs, my life flashed before my eyes. Every single moment that I could remember as a child flashed before my eyes. And the only thing that I want to say about this particular pyramid is that on the left side, from death to conception, that's assuming that those children growing up in that area did not have what Jim just talked about in terms of historical trauma. I come from a family, I come from an ancestry where my people were slaves. So I learned from the ACEs study that at a cellular level, I could be carrying some of the trauma of my ancestors. And they use this term called epigenetics. And I've been in this for 2 years, so I'm kind of on a fast track in this group. So what epigenetics told me is that in this pyramid, each one of those levels that you see in this pyramid, I have an experience that supports each one of them on the right-hand side. And if I don't, there's somebody in my family that does. So this is where intergenerational trauma started playing out for me. Kara, I lost control of the thing. Can you go to the next one? Big takeaway for me and why I wanted to do this work in terms of my story and his story. My biggest takeaway, this is me before I turned 7 years old. And loud and clear, what ACEs started to tell me, all because of this copy machine experience, is that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. Go ahead, Kara. And here's what I decided to do. On May 27th of 2020, a couple days after George Floyd passed away, I was given this vision to say, hey, there are a lot of us living with childhood adversities and its influence in the way we navigate life as an adult, which led to the whole George Floyd and Derek Chauvin situations. Read about them, and sure enough, both of those men had a high number of ACEs. And so what the research told me, based in my own words, I don't speak as eloquent as Jim with some of the college words. I was like, I got to figure out a way to say this to lay people, because had it not been for my privilege, even with my 10 ACEs and growing up in poverty, I happened to be at a copy machine to learn this. And as a result, research says that adults with unhealed ACEs will lead to children with ACEs, and that will repeat the same cycle. Next slide, Kara. So if the first 7 years are foundational in terms of our perception about self and the world, this is my family. I did this tree and I realized from a numerical standpoint, it's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me. So across my generation, and out of the 77 family members that I personally know of, in 5 generations, collectively we share 655 adverse childhood experiences in my family, on my maternal side. An average ACE score of 8.5 between those 77 family members. Next slide. I wanted to spend the last few minutes with researchers saying, like, it is important to include our voice in the story. The original adverse childhood experience story had less than 400 African American people involved in it. And what I did with this graph, which I'm going to just spend a few more minutes on it, is I wanted to know, what was my grandparents like? And if at a cellular level, from the little that I know about epigenetics, if this is telling us that the dendrites, for those of us that are familiar with how the brain works, this is at a cellular level. And those 2 8s that you see, I'm using this based on the adverse childhood experience study where they did the original 10 questions. Those 2 8s are my grandparents. My grandparents left their childhood in the 1920s with a minimum score of an 8. They trauma bonded, and next slide, click the thing. They trauma bonded, and those 8s created 6 7s. So all of their children left the house with at least a minimum score of 7s, and they started making these babies in the 1940s. Now, I want to note that in the 1920s, for any of us that are seasoned enough to remember, that was around the Great Depression time, right? It was starting that time. My grandmother was born into that. So if you add the historical trauma on top of all of that was happening, imagine what her first 7 years of life must have been like. The 7s, if you'll hit next, they started making babies. And starting in the 1970s, all of the children that they created, we all left the house, this is my generation, with at least an ACE score of a 9 or a 10. What do we see happening when we think about how far back this goes, even from the pyramid, from the down up? The 1970s, which would be my generation, the next one, Kara, look what they started creating. Look what we started creating. I'm not going to say they, because one of those children is mine. 8s created 7s, 7s created 9s and 10s, and 9s and 10s started creating 7, 8s, 9s, and 10s. Now, there is a glimmer of hope if you happen to be able to zoom in. There's a couple of 3s and 4s at this moment. But I know from the research that I've done the last 2 years that those 3s and 4s, because of where they're born into, they're going to likely leave the house with at least an ACE score of 6 by the time they leave the house. And again, they're 3s and 4s now because they're toddlers. Next slide. So, and I personally believe, researchers, that if we can start helping families acknowledge that There's nothing wrong with our families. It's what happened. And this trauma has to be manually addressed, manually removed. I think it will help us understand that when you see trees like this, it starts at the roots. And that was the angle that I wanted to come from, because it felt like to me that if we could give communities visuals, pictures talk, they say 1,000 words, and we give them words that help them understand exactly what this science meant on the shelf, then we'll have fewer people bleeding on other people that didn't hurt them. Next slide. So I'm going to close this out by saying I was a victim. I was born into it. The average ACE score of my two parents is an 8. I went from being a victim to a participant. The young lady on the picture with me is not my daughter. She'll be 22 next month. Sadly, I did not know about ACEs. I didn't know that I was carrying this trauma into my parents. So she also left the house with several ACEs, even though I took her out of the poverty part of it. Even though I took her out of the poverty part of it, she still, I became a participant of this whole conspiracy of silence just because of my ignorance. Now, as an ACEs Matter founder, with ACEs Matter being 2 years young, I'm a witness. I get to participate as a witness and see, like, what can I do? Those who teach, those who know should teach. And so you're going to learn later in the program that I created a program so that we could rapidly spread awareness, and you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We just need collaborative relationships with partners that will help us reach these families in the home. And as a result, some of us are going to have to leave with a new identity if our family of origin is not ready to have this conversation. Next slide, Kara. And I'm going to close out by saying my transition. I am when I left the traditional public school building, I had done 2 decades. That was my stint in education, was 20 years. And the group of people that you see on this picture, it happens to be the time in my life where they gave me a school, a Title I school in Houston, Texas. And the school was full of children with adverse childhood experiences and teachers who also had trauma that I unfortunately did not have the tools to support them. Led me to finding ACEs Matter, got my certification, and again, my key message is you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, and all of my experiences have allowed me to bring this program to the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cendie. Thank you. We're so grateful for all you're doing and all you are. And so I wanted to piggyback on what Cendie said around we need collaborations, and we need collaborations in all types of ways. I'm going to share with you a trauma-informed approach to research and care, an example around food insecurity and social justice. So to back up a little bit, I am a social worker, have been for many, many years. And at the McSilver Institute, I help to lead a lot of clinical work that we do. But I also have a nonprofit of my own. It's a anti-hunger organization, food justice organization in the Hudson Valley and Beacon, New York. And so I've always had this interest around disparities and really truly understanding and feel like the light was barely shining on them. And so thanks to McSilver funding, when Dr. Mary McKay was our inaugural director, I was able to conduct some research with her around looking at food insecurity and social justice. Because the reality is that if you, for example, I was looking at some maps in Birmingham, Alabama, around redlining, and today all of those redlining areas are food deserts. So we can look at the complicated ingredients of food insecurity, for example, and we can look at some of those ingredients that I call, which are around disability, incarceration, job loss, divorce, housing insecurity, illnesses, food deserts. Poverty is often a root of food insecurity, but systemic racism is a key contributor to food insecurity and underlies all of those things. So we developed a project called a research study called Family and Food Matters, where we employed mixed methods research to explore the following among food insecure families. So we went into food pantries in New York City and upstate New York, and we looked at caregivers' participation and experience in SNAP, economic stress, social support. We looked at buying, cooking, eating patterns in families, these core areas of family life called the 4 R's and the 2 S's. which are stress and support. We looked at food insecurity. We looked at adverse experiences in caregivers and caregiver reports of adversity in the lives of their children. And the kids were ages 5 to 12. And these are our collaborators down at the bottom. What we found was that our average age of kids was 8. And the mean score for the adults, ACE score was a 3, indicating exposure to childhood trauma. I do have to say that we stopped. We did not get an ACE score for everyone because we realized it's not the best tool for research in a quantitative way. That's how we were using. It's a qualitative tool. So we have many lessons learned, and that was one of them. And so I suspect that report may be higher than we know of. But what we did find is that the study showed as adult food insecurity increased, child ACE increased. As adult ACE increased, child ACE increased. So there's this generational trauma experience around hunger. We also found a web of challenges. We did conduct many interviews, and we found that unemployment, low wage, cost of food, that when people were experiencing an uncertainty of where their next meal was coming from, that it was in the context of other challenges as well, right? So we had some applied implications. So we got recommendations for stakeholders at all levels, from families, service providers, policymakers. And one of the recommendations was to develop a comprehensive curriculum to address food insecurity and to help strengthen families. And so that's what we did. And we have Family Food Matters to caregivers and kids. And we developed this in collaboration with caregivers and kids at a food pantry. And so Family Food Matters to kids and caregivers really aims to increase opportunities for quality family time around healthy plates, is what we call that. Participation, learning, activity, togetherness, eating, and then we have a summary of each session. It's a 7-week manual. It's a strength-based program that focuses on decreasing challenges around having sufficient and healthy foods that we now call nutrition insecurity. So the field is evolving continually, and I'm so grateful to be alive at this time. We're also really aiming at increasing family functioning and support. And because of the trauma findings, it really informed our approach, right? So when we think about trauma in all the various contexts, as well in the household, in our communities, in their environment, we really needed to adapt a curriculum in a trauma-informed way, but also in an anti-oppressive way. So we really focused on using these anti-oppressive principles and practices within our community-based intervention. Thanks to Dr. Mary McKay, way back when I learned about participatory action research. And so this is really what we began to do over time, utilizing the principles of anti-oppressive research around collaboration, right? That participants, families are our collaborators. That there's shared decision-making and power sharing, that they're giving feedback at all times, that there's transparency. We all had the same manual. We all knew, everybody knew what was happening, which is incredibly important. And then I just want to share as a continuation of this, an example of collaborative approaches with families. So these are amazing families. They, as I said, gave feedback after every session, and then we would evolve the sessions based on their feedback and their input. This particular food pantry that we were at is called the Westside Campaign Against Hunger. They also had a chef training program for people that could participate in as they came through the doors. Also, if you came through the doors, you saw a social service provider to assess for other needs. It's a fantastic model. And what we found, that families actually, they were having decreased numbers of food insecurity in their homes. They were spending more time together. They were strengthening their families. And so we found that to be very successful, and so grateful that we continue to do this in some way. And so now we want to share examples of collaborative approaches with communities. And we want to go back to Cendie so that she can share some of the amazing work she's doing.
Thank you, Kara. So I do this thing called an undebatable statement when we have class at the end of the month. And I'll tell you what the class is about, but I think in general, what was just like an alarm for me, especially from my culture and where I grew up, it felt like segregation of information. Even when I pulled the 14-page abbreviated study off of CDC, I had to have a dictionary next to me because there was a lot of stuff that I didn't understand. So not only was it shelved so high away that you had to know the word to go find it, when you do find it, you have to understand it. So for me, I was like, every single person in the world deserves, is a birthright to learn how to prevent ACEs. And I think when I started to really notice it, I could see celebrity stories. I'm like, those are ACEs, and I could point them out, right? And I said that we have started to normalize this just because we feel like, things happen to people. And I'm like, no, it's telling us right now that the solution is in our childhood. And so with that, Carrie, you can go to the next one. With that, I wanted other people to believe me. And I was like, this is what every single research study is saying that people with ACEs need to be doing if you want to rehabilitate your nervous system. It kept coming up in everything that I was reading, and particularly this one came out of Nadine Burke-Harris's book. And so high and low, it was saying that if you have ACEs and these 6 things are not a part of your daily routine, your nervous system is not going to ever calm back down, pretty much is what it was telling me. So I started doing these things. Right? Like naturally started doing these things. And then I realized I was gaining a lot of information, and it was super helpful, although overwhelming. And I wanted to find out, well, how can we get everybody else to start doing these things, especially if you have ACEs, to try these 6 things and stick with them. I was having a hard time sticking with them. Next slide. So I realized that information will give you something to think about, but connection will give you something to live for. So I found 17 participants in 12 different states. All of us lived experience survivors. All of us had some stuff we was going through in our adulthood. And we realized that we could come together, and I created a cohort. This is our very first cohort of learners, and we get together once a month as a whole group. And we bring in subject matter experts. We're collaborating with subject matter experts who know this stuff, from epigenetics all the way down to mirror work. And we bring them in, and they host our classes. And so the Reachers, which is an acronym, we get to learn about our own ACEs. And then in turn, next slide, Kara, we get to go out and share what we're learning with the communities where we live, work, and serve. We don't get paid for it. We just do it because we know there's 2 types of adults in the world. Those who had childhood trauma and those who didn't. Plain and simple. And to know that everybody deserves to learn about this, we have to accept that if there are people that are not buying into this, as Jim talked about earlier with, some of the controversy surrounded around, giving people advice on how to raise children, our due diligence is we better learn about it, because we're going to have to interact with those people that don't want our advice. At some point, we're going to interact with their kids. And so what you see in front of you are 17 people, all with lived experiences, all during the pandemic. I met at some point from the pandemic up until now, who were all out trying to use their voice on a cause that mattered to them. Little did they know, one of the ladies here talks about domestic violence. Little did she know that ACEs led to her even having that conversation. So she joined the cause. And now she has the arm of adding adverse childhood experience understanding to her conversations when she's talking to teens about domestic violence. I have a former drug abuser who is now turned into an advocate. He was one of the people who unfortunately crack cocaine was his drug of choice after his childhood trauma. Now that he's 100% clean and recovered, he's using his voice to share with other people his transition, but what he's doing is he's adding an understanding of ACEs to his talk. And so each month we get together, and then this actually supports my conclusion that information will give you something to think about, connection gives you something to live for. Beyond the class of us meeting together once a month, they get together as a group. So in those groups, they're together once a month, connecting, total strangers from all over the country, sharing some of the most personal, intimate struggles, and then using each other to help overcome those, and then coming back together. We're on a text group. It's like everything. This is my new family that really believe in what we're doing. So next slide, Karen. So in short, as a part of this collaborative effort, food happens to be one of our conversations that we want to bring up at some point when we get into the communities. But essentially, after 11 months in this program with me, they're going to leave as trauma-aware community influencers. They're going to have a certificate that says they are qualified enough to start a conversation about ACEs to people who are willing to listen. Can you hit the button, Karen? It's going to cover that up. And this is them. Together, the 18 of us, our average ACE score is a 7. and we're not shamed about it. We wish we could change it. It would be nice, but we also realize that our lived experiences are going to help us help other people. But before we do that, this program that I've created forces us to like look at ourselves in the mirror and make sure that we have the tools and we're equipped to handle even some of the secondary trauma that's going to be experienced as a result of opening up this Pandora's box. Next slide. Our focus in this group are around the 8 dimensions of well-being. We are intentionally looking for collaborations with people who help bring balance to these areas of our life. Financial security happens to be one of the most important ones, which goes back to the poverty and which goes back to historical trauma. But in those 8 realms, we want to work with partners who can help us bring balance not only to our own lives, but to the lives of those in the community that are going to hear about these things called ACEs. And so under the 8 dimensions of well-being, we feel like that is foundational to overcoming our adverse childhood experiences. Thank you, Karen. Do you want me to do that one or Jim?
Thank you, Cendie.
Okay.
Jim's going to talk about it. Maybe. Jim?
Come on, Jim.
I can.
I'm just going to give
So
you just a 2-minute warning. So,
2-minute warning,
because we
will
want to
be- this-
take one question at least.
Perfect.
It will be 2 minutes. And very quickly, so Cendie, apologies, that was me. For some reason, when you had remote access, anytime I tried to unmute or share my video, it would click the slide advance. So sorry about that. That was all me. Very quickly, one of the things that we collaborated on with Cendie was the development of this brochure that's intended to raise awareness. Our hope is, and we've already kind of posted this is a resource that we put up on our CTAC website at the McSilver Institute to make available to providers. We, and again, in collaborating with Cendie and identifying how do we talk to folks, what are the messages that we want to include in here that are critically important about ACEs so that we allow people to understand ACEs, but also find hope and give them some idea about what they can do. So this is what we came up with, and we share this with folks. This is not necessarily a research, a product of research just yet, but what our hope is that we can continue to, in collaboration with Cendie, raise awareness about ACEs. In many ways, again, as Cendie has said, we believe that oftentimes that can be the starting point to healing and resilience and recovery. And then in summary, these are just a few things, so if this work is to continue, if we're going to raise awareness about trauma and the impact of trauma and toxic stress on folks, we have to disrupt that conspiracy of silence. We have to stop being silent about these issues and bring them to the forefront. Apply anti-oppressive, anti-racist practice continuously. And that often does involve talking about systems that impact an individual and their families, and then starting the conversations in communities. And I think as Cendie is doing with her Reachers work, finding folks out there, trusted messengers who can talk about these issues from lived experience can be so critical. And then following California's ACEs screening model, screening for ACEs as often and as much as possible across our systems, and then grassroots, working with grassroots nonprofit organizations that can also work in those communities very openly. So those are just some various summary points that we want to leave you with, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Beautiful. So first of all, if anybody has learned anything, enjoyed our speakers, been inspired, please put some love in that chat, because this has been a tremendous presentation. And for our speakers, you should take a look at some of the chat. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I want to just call attention to a couple of things. So Nicholas put in the chat a feedback form, and you can do it one more time, Nicholas. So please, as we're answering this, last question, if you'd fill out that feedback form for us, we'd really appreciate it. So I think you do great work. Cendie, I can't tell you how impressed I was with your presentation. I mean, I know I love, Kara and Jim when they talk, but your ability to break down in human terms what these terms, ACEs, and what that means in your life, and what is truly a gift. I would imagine that there's some friction points as you collaborate across projects, even across putting together presentations. tell our audience how to navigate those, because there can be conflict, there can be controversy, there can be misunderstandings. And I think it's one of the obstacles that actually prevents more collaborative work from going forward. So if you kind of just give us your wisdom around that, I'd really appreciate it in the last couple of minutes.
I'm just going to do one because mine is going to be quick. Ms. McKay, I don't collaborate with anybody that's not values aligned with the work that I'm doing. And that's it. And so when I have events, for me, that's important. And I think at least if I go in with that lens, it removes some of those barriers.
Think about the simplicity of what Cendie just said. If there's not value alignment, we can't work together. And so I think that's, and we often don't think about that in these research collaborations around how we're putting them together. So incredibly important. Kara, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said about affinity groups. And I think that's what Cendie's saying. It's that we can develop affinity with the community and find those voices out there that do. Our collaboration with Cendie, I think, as you were saying, Mary, there's oftentimes, difficulties and challenges, but our work with Cendie, it was, Cendie, if I might say, it was love at first sight. I mean, there was that affinity right away. We knew where she was coming from. We knew, and she knew where we were coming from. And it made the work so much more, obviously easier, but also more effective. And the production that you could see is incredible.
Beautiful.
And sharing, I just want to say sharing platforms, giving platforms to other voices to be heard at all times.
Nicholas has one final question. I think it goes to Cendie. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cendie. There was a question in the chat from Cora Hughes that asked, do you think every family should take the ACEs test to better understand their life history? And can you give your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes, and just be very careful how it's presented. I messed up. I messed up. And I messed up. I just assumed when I found out, everybody else wanted to know. And that is the lie detector determined that is not right. But yes, I do believe that every person, just like you know your diabetes score, your high cholesterol, so you need to know your ACE score so you know your risk of passing them down.
Thank you so much, Cendie.
So with that, I just want to thank our presenters. So well done. And there'll be opportunities again. This particular webinar will be posted on a set of websites, pushed out to people. I so thank you for sharing your wisdom and making a difference with this work. And with that, I want to thank Washington University, the Brown School. You've been awesome. Peter, the collaboration with you on behalf of the Academy, thank you. And have a good day, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.